June 9, 1944. The skies over Nazi-occupied France, 22,000 feet above the rolling countryside of Normandy. Lieutenant James Jefferson of the 332nd Fighter Group banked his P-51 Mustang sharply to the left as he spotted the unmistakable silhouettes of German fighters moving into attack position. 3 days after D-Day, and the Luftwaffe was determined to strike back against the Allied air superiority with everything they had left. Jefferson believed his 8-plane formation was ready for anything the Germans could throw at them. He was about to discover how terribly wrong that assessment would be. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a single African-American pilot, facing impossible odds, would use a maneuver so unorthodox and dangerous that his own commanders would later call it tactically unsound and borderline suicidal. Yet it would result in one of the most remarkable air combat victories of the Second World War, forever changing how the Luftwaffe viewed the pilots they had dismissively nicknamed the Black Birdmen. Lieutenant James Jefferson had never intended to be a pilot. Growing up in Detroit, Michigan, the son of an automobile factory worker, his dreams had been more practical, perhaps following his father into the growing automobile industry, or using his natural aptitude for mathematics to become an engineer. The military had never factored into his plans, but December 7, 1941 changed everything for America, and for Jefferson personally. "My country was at war," he would later write in his memoir, "and despite how that country sometimes treated men who looked like me, it was still my country. I felt a duty to serve, even knowing I would face battles beyond just those against the Germans or Japanese." Jefferson was referring, of course, to the systemic racism that pervaded American society and its military. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army Air Forces were still segregated, with black airmen relegated to separate units and facilities. The very existence of black combat pilots was the result of intense pressure from civil rights organizations and newspapers, which had forced the reluctant War Department to establish a training program for African-American aviators at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. On the other side of the conflict, Hauptmann Wilhelm Müller of Jagdgeschwader 26 had followed a very different path to the skies. The son of a Luftwaffe officer who had served in the Great War, Müller had been raised in the militaristic culture of Nazi Germany. By age 12, he had joined the Hitler Youth, and by 16 he was already training in gliders, preparing for a career in the Air Force. When war came in 1939, Müller was among the first wave of pilots to see combat in the Polish campaign. "We were invincible," Müller would later recall in a post-war interview. "That's what we believed, what we were told. The Führer had created the greatest air force in history, and we were its elite. How could any enemy stand against us?" By 1944, that sense of invincibility had been severely tested. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was increasingly outmatched by growing Allied air power. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang with its long range had been particularly devastating, allowing Allied fighters to escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. Fuel shortages and the loss of experienced pilots further hampered German air operations. Yet Müller remained one of Germany's top aces, with 67 confirmed kills to his credit. More importantly, he commanded a specially assembled Staffel squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s, the nimble German fighters that could outperform most Allied aircraft in a dogfight. This unit, nicknamed Müller's Wolves, consisted of veteran pilots chosen for their experience and aggressiveness. On the morning of June 9, 1944, these two men, Jefferson and Müller, were on a collision course, though neither yet knew it. For the pilots of the 322nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, as they would later become known, the days following D-Day were a whirlwind of constant action. As Allied ground forces struggled to establish and expand their beachheads in Normandy, air superiority was essential. The 322nd, flying their distinctive red-tailed P-51 Mustangs, had been tasked with escorting bomber formations targeting German supply lines and reinforcements. "We flew until we couldn't see straight," recalled Captain Benjamin Davis III, the operations officer for the 332nd and son of General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the unit's commander. "Sometimes 3 missions a day, sleep when you could, eat when you remembered. Every mission was crucial. The boys on the ground were counting on us. Jefferson had already flown 4 missions since D-Day when he was assigned as element leader in a flight of 8 Mustangs tasked with escorting B-17s to bomb a railway junction near Caen. The weather that morning was clear, dangerously clear, offering no cloud cover for protection, with visibility of 25 miles. Perfect conditions for aerial combat. In the briefing room at their base in Ramitelli, Italy, Lieutenant Colonel Davis had been explicit about their mission parameters. Gentlemen, your primary responsibility is bomber protection. Do not, I repeat, do not, get drawn away from the bombers in pursuit of enemy fighters. That's exactly what they want. Stay with your formations. Stay disciplined. The emphasis on discipline was a reflection of the unique burden carried by the Tuskegee Airmen. As the only black fighter pilots in the American forces, they operated under constant scrutiny. Any failure, any deviation from protocol, would be used as evidence that African Americans weren't suited for combat aviation. It was a pressure that white pilots never had to bear, the knowledge that their individual performance would be used to judge an entire race. Jefferson understood this burden all too well. At 23 years old, he was already a veteran of 15 combat missions, with 3 confirmed kills to his credit. His Mustang, which he had named Mabel's Son after his mother, was adorned with 3 small swastikas under the cockpit, marking his victories. As they took off that morning, climbing into the crystal blue Mediterranean sky, Jefferson performed his usual ritual, tapping the photograph of his family that he kept taped to his instrument panel. His father Samuel, mother Mabel, and younger sister Louise smiled up at him from the black and white snapshot, a reminder of what he was fighting for, not just his country, but for the day when men like him would be judged by their character and abilities rather than the color of their skin. 2 hours into the mission, as the bomber formation approached its target, Jefferson's earpiece crackled with a warning from the group leader, Captain Harold Carter. "Red 3, this is Red Leader. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, looks like 190s. Stay in formation." Jefferson acknowledged the order, scanning the sky where Carter had indicated. Sure enough, he spotted them, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s, at least a dozen, moving into position for an attack on the bomber formation. What Jefferson didn't know was that these were no ordinary German fighters. They were Muller's Wolves, and they had been specifically waiting for this bomber group. German intelligence had identified the railway junction near Caen as a likely Allied target, and Muller had positioned his squadron accordingly. The presence of the distinctive red-tailed Mustangs of the 382nd was an unexpected bonus. Like many in the Luftwaffe, Muller had heard rumors about the black American pilots, but had never encountered them in combat. "We had heard they were inferior pilots," Muller would later write, "given outdated aircraft and simple missions because the Americans didn't trust them with anything important. Some of our intelligence officers even suggested they should be targeted preferentially, as they would be easy kills." This assessment could not have been more wrong, as Muller was about to discover. As the German fighters dove toward the bomber formation, the Mustangs of the 382nd moved to intercept. Jefferson and his wingman, Lieutenant Wesley Roberts, climbed to meet the attacking 190s. "Red 3-2, stay on my wing," a Jefferson radioed to Roberts. "We'll take the lead element." What followed was a confused melee of aircraft. The 190s, realizing they faced determined opposition from the Mustangs, split their formation. 4 continued toward the bombers, while the others engaged the fighters of the 332nd. Captain Carter's voice came over the radio again. "Red 3, Red 4, break off and pursue the bandits heading for the bombers. The rest of us will handle these ones." Jefferson acknowledged and banked sharply, Roberts staying tight on his wing as they pursued the 4 Focke-Wulfs that were streaking toward the vulnerable bombers. With the Mustang's superior speed at high altitude, they quickly closed the distance. Jefferson lined up his gun sight on the trailing German fighter and pressed the trigger. His 6 .50 caliber machine guns hammered, sending a stream of tracers toward the enemy aircraft. He saw his rounds striking the 190's fuselage and wing, sending fragments flying off. The German fighter rolled suddenly and dove away, trailing smoke, damaged but not destroyed. But as Jefferson pulled up from his attack run, His cockpit was suddenly filled with the hammering sound of bullets striking his aircraft. One of the other 190s had reversed course and gotten on his tail. "Red 3-2, I've got one on me," Jefferson called to Roberts. "I see him, Red 3. Brake right, brake right." Jefferson threw his Mustang into a tight right turn, the G-forces pressing him hard into his seat. The 190 followed, but the Mustang's tighter turning radius at this altitude gave Jefferson an advantage. As he completed the turn, the German fighter overshot, and now it was Jefferson who was in position to attack. Again his guns blazed, and this time his aim was true. The 190 erupted in flames and entered a spinning dive. Jefferson had no time to watch it fall. The other two German fighters were still heading for the bombers. He and Roberts raced after them, pushing their Mustangs to maximum speed. They caught up just as the Germans were moving into firing position, behind the last B-17 in the formation. "Red 3-2, you take the one on the left. I've got the right," Jefferson ordered. The two Mustangs attacked simultaneously. Roberts's target broke off immediately, diving away from the threat. But the pilot Jefferson engaged was more determined, or perhaps more desperate. Despite the danger of the Mustang on his tail, he continued his approach to the bomber, his guns firing. Jefferson watched in horror as the B-17's right outboard engine took hits, black smoke pouring from it. 10 men were in that bomber. He had to stop the German now. His next burst caught the 190 squarely in the cockpit area. The German fighter ceased firing instantly and rolled inverted, plummeting toward the earth with no attempt at recovery. Its pilot had undoubtedly been killed instantly. "Red 3, Red 3-2, bombers clear," Jefferson reported. "2 bandits down, 1 damaged, 1 retreating." "Roger, Red 3, came Captain Carter's voice. "Return to formation. We've got our hands full up here." As Jefferson and Roberts climbed back to rejoin their squadron, they could see the swirling dogfight above them. The remaining P-51s of their flight were engaged with at least 8 Focke-Wulfs, and it appeared that one of the Mustangs was already missing. What they couldn't see was that another formation of German fighters, 8 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, was approaching from the east, drawn by the radio traffic and the visible aerial combat. It was a trap that had been carefully planned by Muller, who had coordinated with a nearby Messerschmitt unit to provide reinforcement once the Americans committed to battle. The tactical situation was rapidly deteriorating for the outnumbered American pilots. As Jefferson and Roberts rejoined the fight, the odds became even clearer. 2 of their 8 original Mustangs were nowhere to be seen, either shot down or forced to withdraw due to damage or fuel considerations. The 6 remaining P-51s were faced with at least 14 enemy fighters, Müller's remaining Focke-Wulfs, plus the newly arrived Messerschmitts. Captain Carter's voice crackled over the radio, tense but controlled. "Red Flight, we are outnumbered. Disengage and return to the bombers. I repeat, disengage immediately." It was the textbook correct decision. The 332nd's primary mission was bomber protection, not air-to-air combat for its own sake. With the bombers now well past the immediate threat zone and heading back toward Allied lines, the fighters needed to resume their escort positions. But disengaging from combat is often more dangerous than the combat itself. As the Mustangs attempted to break away, the German fighters pressed their advantage, sensing weakness. Jefferson had just executed a tight turn to avoid a 109 on his tail when he saw Captain Carter's Mustang take a burst of cannon fire from one of the Focke-Wulfs. Carter's aircraft shuddered, and dark fluid, probably oil or coolant, began streaming from its engine compartment. "Red Leader is hit," Jefferson called over the radio. "Red Leader, what's your status?" "Engines losing power," Carter replied, his voice remarkably calm. "I can maintain altitude for now, but not for long. Continue with disengagement, get back to the bombers." Jefferson knew what Carter wasn't saying, that a damaged fighter alone in hostile airspace had very poor survival chances. The honorable thing by the book would be to follow orders and leave Carter to his fate. But Jefferson had not survived 15 combat missions by always following the book. "Red 3-2, stay with the formation," he ordered Roberts. "I'm going to cover Red Leader." Before Roberts could protest, Jefferson had already broken away, climbing sharply to position himself above and behind Carter's struggling Mustang. From this position, he could see the full extent of the tactical situation, and it was grim. The German fighters, realizing they had a wounded prey, were regrouping for another attack. Müller, the experienced Luftwaffe ace, was directing his fighters with hand signals, positioning them for a coordinated strike that would overwhelm any defense. Jefferson keyed his microphone. "Red Leader, you've got at least 6 bandits setting up for another pass. We need to try something else. Standard evasion isn't going to work." Carter's response was immediate. "Negative, Red 3. Return to formation. That's an order." Jefferson's hand tightened on the control stick. Everything in his training told him to obey that direct order. But something deeper, an instinct for survival honed through combat experience, told him that leaving now would mean Carter's certain death. In that moment, as he watched the German fighters moving into position, an idea began to form in Jefferson's mind. It was unorthodox, dangerous, probably foolhardy, but conventional tactics had already failed them. "Red Leader," he said, his decision made, "I'm going to try something. Just stay on your current heading." Without waiting for a response, Jefferson pushed his throttle to full military power and climbed steeply, gaining precious altitude. His mind raced through the calculations: airspeed, altitude, fuel state, the positions of the enemy aircraft. What he was about to attempt would require perfect timing and execution. The German fighters, focused on the damaged Mustang, didn't immediately notice Jefferson's maneuver. Müller, directing the attack formation, was positioning his fighters in a standard high-low pincer movement. 4 aircraft would attack from above and behind, while 2 would approach from below, cutting off any dive Carter might attempt. It was a textbook setup for dealing with a damaged enemy fighter, and it would have worked perfectly against a conventional defense. But what Jefferson had in mind was anything but conventional. As the German fighters began their approach, Jefferson rolled his Mustang inverted at 28, saw 2 feet and pulled the nose down into a near-vertical dive, directly toward the attacking formation. His airspeed built rapidly, 400 mph, 450, 500. The Mustang began to vibrate as it approached its structural limits. This was the maneuver that would later be described as crazy and tactically unsound by military analysts. Combat doctrine called for careful energy management and positional advantage, not a headlong charge into superior numbers. It was the aerial equivalent of a cavalry charge against machine guns, a desperate gamble that seemed to defy all logic. But Jefferson had recognized a critical psychological factor. The Germans were focused on an easy kill. They weren't expecting a counterattack, especially not one of such reckless aggression. As his Mustang screamed downward at over 500 miles per hour, Jefferson lined up his gun sight on the lead German fighter, Müller himself, though Jefferson couldn't have known this. At a range of 600 yards, still closing at phenomenal speed, Jefferson opened fire. The German formation, caught completely by surprise, broke in all directions. Müller, taking hits from Jefferson's initial burst, rolled his Focke-Wulf into a split S maneuver, attempting to dive away from the threat. But the American pilot stayed with him, his Mustang's tremendous speed allowing him to follow the diving 190. Jefferson continued firing in short, controlled bursts. At such high speed, his aircraft was difficult to control precisely, but he managed to keep the German fighter centered in his gun sight. More hits struck Müller's aircraft, sending fragments of metal and canopy glass flying away in the slipstream. Realizing he couldn't outrun the diving Mustang, Müller attempted a desperate reversal, pulling up sharply in an attempt to force an overshoot. It was a maneuver that had saved him before, using the Focke-Wulf's excellent low-speed handling to outturn pursuing fighters. But Jefferson had anticipated this. Rather than trying to follow the German's turn, which would indeed have caused an overshoot at his current speed, he continued his dive for another 1,000 feet before pulling up in a high G climb that bled off his excess speed while gaining separation. As he crested his climb, Jefferson rolled and looked for the German fighter. Müller was now below him, still turning, apparently believing he had forced the American to overshoot. It was the opportunity Jefferson needed. Again he dove, this time with more controlled speed, positioning himself perfectly for a deflection shot as the 190 completed its turn. His .50 caliber guns hammered once more, and this time the effect was devastating. The German fighter's right wing separated completely, torn away by the powerful American bullets. The Focke-Wulf, now completely uncontrollable, entered a wild tumble toward the ground. Jefferson pulled up from his attack run and immediately had to dodge as another German fighter, a Messerschmitt this time, flashed past him, its guns firing. The 109 had nearly collided with him, so close was its pass. This was the critical moment of vulnerability in Jefferson's unorthodox tactic. Having committed fully to his attack on Müller, he had momentarily lost situational awareness of the other enemy fighters. Now, as he regained his bearings, he found himself in the middle of the German formation, with enemy aircraft all around him. Conventional wisdom said he was doomed. A lone fighter surrounded by multiple enemies had virtually no chance of survival. The standard tactic would be to dive away at full speed, accepting that he would likely take hits while attempting to escape. But Jefferson had already abandoned conventional tactics. Instead of diving, he pulled his Mustang into a tight climbing turn, deliberately placing himself in the middle of 3 German fighters. The Germans, expecting him to flee, were momentarily confused by this maneuver. Their confusion turned to chaos when Jefferson abruptly reversed his turn, now diving toward one of the 109s. The German pilot, startled by this unexpected aggression, broke away in a diving turn, directly into the path of another Focke-Wulf that was moving to attack Jefferson. The 2 German aircraft didn't collide, but they came close enough that both pilots had to take violent evasive action, disrupting the coordinated attack the Germans had been attempting to set up. This moment of disorder was exactly what Jefferson had been trying to create. Combat aviation, like all warfare, relies on coordination and predictability among teammates. By forcing himself into the middle of the German formation and behaving unpredictably, Jefferson had turned the Germans' numerical advantage against them. Now, they had to worry not only about hitting him but about hitting each other. Seizing the initiative, Jefferson attacked again, selecting another Focke-Wulf that was turning to engage him. A short burst from his guns struck the German fighter's engine, sending a plume of black smoke streaming behind it. The FW-190 rolled over and dove away, its pilot clearly deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. But Jefferson's ammunition was running dangerously low. His fuel situation, after the extended high-power maneuvering, was becoming critical as well. He needed to find Carter and get them both back to Allied lines immediately. Climbing to regain altitude and perspective, Jefferson spotted Carter's Mustang several miles away, still on its original heading but noticeably lower. At least 2 German fighters were still pursuing it, though they were making cautious, probing attacks rather than committing fully. Jefferson keyed his radio. "Red Leader, Red 3, I'm about 2 miles behind you, coming up fast. How's your aircraft?" "Red 3, engines failing. I'm losing altitude steadily. Fuel pressure's dropping too." "Roger. I've scattered the main German formation, but you've still got 2 on your tail. I'll clear them, then we'll get you home." Jefferson pushed his Mustang to maximum continuous power, closing the distance to Carter's position. The 2 German fighters, both Messerschmitts, saw him coming and turned to meet the new threat. This was exactly what Jefferson had hoped for. With their attention now on him, Carter might have a chance to extend his distance and reach safety. "Red Leader, dive now! Get as much speed as you can and head for the deck. Use that speed to extend toward home." Carter's acknowledgement was terse. "Roger, Red 3. Good hunting." As Carter's damaged Mustang dove away, Jefferson engaged the 2 Messerschmitts. He was now facing opponents who were prepared for him, not caught by surprise as Müller's formation had been, and with his ammunition and fuel both running low, he couldn't afford an extended dogfight. Jefferson decided on a bold bluff. Rather than attempting to outmaneuver the 2 109s, he charged directly at the lead aircraft, as though he intended to ram it head-on. It was a game of aerial chicken, and one that required absolute nerve. The German pilot, faced with this seemingly suicidal approach, broke first, diving away to avoid the collision. His wingman, momentarily alone and uncertain, hesitated just long enough for Jefferson to swing his gun sight across the 109's cockpit and fire a brief, precisely aimed burst. The German aircraft shuddered as the heavy bullet struck home. It didn't go down immediately, but the damage was clearly significant. The Messerschmitt pulled away in a shallow climbing turn, trailing fluid from its damaged engine. Jefferson had no ammunition to pursue the second fighter, nor the fuel to engage further, even if he'd wanted to. His priority now was catching up with Carter and ensuring both of them returned safely. Pushing his Mustang to its limits, Jefferson descended rapidly, scanning the sky for Carter's aircraft. He found it just as it was disappearing into a bank of clouds at about 8,000 feet, still heading in the direction of Allied lines, but losing altitude steadily. "Red Leader, I've cleared your tail. What's your status?" Carter's voice came back, noticeably strained. "Not good, Red 3. Engine's about to quit completely. Oil pressure 0. Coolant temperature redlined. I'm going to have to put it down soon." Jefferson quickly calculated their position. They were still over occupied France, about 60 miles from Allied lines, too far for Carter's failing aircraft to reach friendly territory. "Understood, Red Leader. I'll stay with you. Let me know when you're selecting a landing site." Negative, Red 3. Return to base. No sense in both of us being at risk. Jefferson ignored the order. "My fuel state is too low for a direct return anyway," he lied. "I'll need to land and refuel at one of the new Allied strips near the beachhead." It wasn't true, but it gave him a plausible excuse to stay with his commander. In reality, Jefferson had no intention of abandoning Carter to face capture alone. As they emerged from the cloud bank, both pilots could see the French countryside spread out below them. It was a patchwork of fields and forests, with small villages scattered throughout. Somewhere down there were German troops, French resistance fighters, and civilians caught in between. A complex battlefield that would be just as dangerous on the ground as the air combat they'd just survived. Carter's engine finally failed completely about 5 minutes later. His voice remained remarkably calm as he reported, "Red 3, engine's dead. I've spotted what looks like a suitable field about 2 miles ahead. I'm going in." "Roger, Red Leader, I see it. I'll circle overhead and cover your landing." Jefferson watched as Carter expertly guided his powerless Mustang toward the selected field. Despite the aircraft's damage and his precarious situation, Carter executed a textbook dead-stick landing, touching down smoothly and rolling to a stop near a hedgerow at the field's edge. Jefferson circled overhead, scanning for any immediate threats. The field Carter had chosen was isolated, with no visible roads nearby, good for avoiding immediate capture, but potentially difficult for escape and evasion later. Keying his radio one last time, Jefferson said, "Red Leader, good landing. No visible threats in your immediate vicinity. I'm low on fuel and need to head for home. Resistance groups are active in this area. Find cover and wait for dark." Carter's response was simple. "Understood, Red 3. Thank you. Now get yourself home." With a final wing waggle of acknowledgement, Jefferson turned his Mustang toward Allied lines. The fuel gauge showed less than 15 minutes of flight time remaining. It would be close, but he thought he could make it to one of the newly established forward airstrips near the Normandy beachhead. As he flew east, Jefferson mentally reviewed the extraordinary combat he had just survived. He had taken on superior numbers, shot down at least 2 enemy fighters confirmed, damaged several others, and successfully covered his commander's emergency landing, all while executing a tactic that violated conventional combat doctrine. What he didn't yet realize was that his actions would have far-reaching consequences beyond this single mission. In the Luftwaffe command post at Evreux, the reports coming in from the surviving pilots of Möller's squadron were causing considerable consternation. Möller himself was dead, his Focke-Wulf having crashed with its wing torn off. 2 other pilots were missing, 3 aircraft had returned with significant damage, and the remainder reported being scattered by a single American fighter that had attacked with unprecedented aggression. Oberstleutnant Gerhard Richter, the Geschwader commander, was initially skeptical of these reports. The idea that a single Allied fighter had taken on a full staffel of experienced Luftwaffe pilots and emerged victorious seemed implausible at best. "You're telling me that Hauptmann Müller, one of our most decorated aces, was shot down by a lone American?" he demanded of Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, one of the surviving pilots. Schmidt, still visibly shaken by the encounter, nodded. "It was one of the red-tailed Mustangs, Herr Oberstleutnant, the ones flown by the Negro pilots." This information gave Richter pause. The Luftwaffe had been receiving intelligence about the 332nd Fighter Group, the all-black unit that had been nicknamed the Schwarze Vogelmenschen, Black Birdmen, by some German pilots. Until now, Luftwaffe Command had largely dismissed them as a propaganda exercise by the Americans, not a serious combat unit. "Describe the engagement," Richter ordered. Schmidt detailed Jefferson's unconventional diving attack, the disruption of their formation, and the subsequent confusion that had allowed the American to fight effectively despite being heavily outnumbered. When Schmidt had finished, Richter was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Draft a full report immediately. Include every detail, no matter how small. And send a signal to Berlin updating the tactical assessment of the American Negro fighter units. It seems we have underestimated them." This reassessment would eventually find its way into Luftwaffe tactical directives, instructing German pilots to treat the red-tailed Mustangs with the same caution as other elite Allied units, a significant change from previous guidance. Meanwhile, Jefferson was facing his own crisis. His fuel situation had become desperate, the gauge now showing empty. The Mustang's Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was still running smoothly for now, drawing on the last reserves in the fuel lines, but could quit at any moment. The coastline was visible ahead, and with it the expanded Allied beachhead. Jefferson could make out the sprawling logistics operation that was feeding the invasion: ships offshore, temporary docks, vehicles moving along the beaches and inland roads, and most importantly, several hastily constructed airstrips where C-47 transports and fighter aircraft were taking off and landing. Jefferson selected the nearest strip and radioed an emergency approach. His call was answered immediately. The controllers were well accustomed to handling aircraft in distress after days of intense air operations. "Red 3, this is Beach Control. You are cleared for immediate landing on Strip 4. Emergency vehicles standing by. Beach Control, Red 3. Be advised I am critically low on fuel. Engine may quit at any time." "Understood, Red 3. Strip 4 is clear for your approach. Wind is light, 5 knots from the west." Jefferson lined up his approach carefully, knowing he would get only one chance. With his altitude and airspeed precisely calculated for a dead-stick landing if necessary, he guided the Mustang toward the crude runway, which was little more than a stretch of metal matting laid directly on the sand. He was less than half a mile from touchdown when the engine coughed once, twice, and then stopped. The sudden silence was startling after hours of the Merlin's powerful roar. Jefferson maintained his composure, adjusting his glide angle slightly to compensate for the loss of power. The Mustang was now a very expensive glider, but its aerodynamics were excellent, and Jefferson's skill was equal to the challenge. The P-51 touched down firmly but under control, rolling along the metal matting until its speed bled off. As it came to a stop, Jefferson sagged in his harness, suddenly aware of the extreme fatigue that had been held at bay by combat adrenaline and the concentration required for flying. Ground crew personnel ran toward the aircraft. Jefferson canopy, and climbed wearily out onto the wing. A young sergeant was the first to reach him. "That was some landing, sir. Engine trouble." Jefferson managed a tired smile. "Ran her dry, Sergeant. Not a drop left." The sergeant whistled. "You cut it mighty fine, sir, but you made it." He paused, looking at Jefferson with mild surprise. The 332nd operated primarily from Italian bases, and the sight of a black fighter pilot was still unusual at the Normandy beachhead. "You're one of the Red Tails." It wasn't a question, but Jefferson nodded anyway. "Lieutenant James Jefferson, 332nd Fighter Group." Recognition dawned in the sergeant's eyes. "From the bomber escort mission?" "Sir, word's already come down about that. Your group leader radioed that you'd stayed behind to cover a damaged aircraft. They thought you might not make it back. Captain Carter, did he make it back to Allied lines?" The sergeant shook his head. "No word on him yet, sir, but the bombers all returned safely. They're saying it was one hell of a scrap up there." It was. Jefferson didn't elaborate. The full story would wait for the official debriefing. That debriefing took place several hours later, after Jefferson had been transported to the main Allied Air Operations Center near the beachhead. There, he found himself facing not just the usual intelligence officers, but Brigadier General Forrest Williams, the commanding officer of the fighter groups supporting the Normandy operations. The general cut an imposing figure, tall and lean with the weathered face of a career military man. He listened impassively as Jefferson recounted the mission, the encounter with Muller's fighters, and his decision to stay with Captain Carter. When Jefferson described his unorthodox diving attack against superior numbers, the general's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment. Only when the lieutenant had finished his report did Williams speak. "Lieutenant Jefferson, would you say your tactics in this engagement were consistent with standard fighter combat doctrine?" Jefferson straightened in his chair. "No, sir, they were not." "And were you aware that Captain Carter had explicitly ordered you to rejoin the main formation?" "Yes, sir." "Yet you chose to disregard that order." "I did, sir." Williams was silent for a moment, studying the young pilot. Then he said, "The Germans you engaged were from Jagdgeschwader 26, specifically a special unit commanded by Hauptmann Wilhelm Müller, one of their leading aces with 67 confirmed kills. Müller is now confirmed dead. Based on gun camera footage from your aircraft and reports from the surviving bombers, you are officially credited with 3 enemy aircraft destroyed and 2 damaged." Jefferson blinked in surprise. He hadn't realized his aircraft's gun camera had been functioning during the engagement. "Furthermore," Williams continued, "Captain Carter has been recovered after you departed. He made contact with local resistance forces who hid him until last night, when they were able to smuggle him back through German lines. He's currently in a field hospital with a minor injury sustained during the escape, but he'll make a full recovery." Relief washed over Jefferson. Carter was safe. "Captain Carter's report describes your actions as, and I quote, displaying extraordinary courage and skill beyond the call of duty," Williams said. "He credits you with saving his life and disrupting a German formation that outnumbered you by more than 3 to 1. The general leaned forward. "Lieutenant, I want to be clear. Your tactical decisions violated combat doctrine and direct orders. Under normal circumstances, that would warrant disciplinary action." Jefferson nodded, accepting the rebuke. "However," Williams continued, "these were not normal circumstances. Your unorthodox approach achieved results that conventional tactics likely would not have. Sometimes combat requires improvisation and initiative beyond established doctrine." He sat back in his chair. "I'll be recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and I'd like you to prepare a detailed analysis of this engagement for distribution to our fighter training programs. There may be valuable lessons in your experience." Jefferson was stunned. "Thank you, sir." As the debriefing concluded and Jefferson rose to leave, Williams added one final comment. "Lieutenant, I understand the 332nd carries burdens that other fighter groups do not. The scrutiny, the need to prove yourselves constantly. It's not fair, but it's reality. Just know that in this theater, under my command, you and your fellow pilots will be judged by your actions and abilities, nothing else. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Dismissed, Lieutenant, and well done." That night, as Jefferson rested in a temporary barracks awaiting transport back to his unit in Italy, he wrote a letter to his parents in Detroit. He described the mission in general terms. Military censorship would prevent him from including specific details, but emphasized that he and his fellow pilots of the 332nd were making a difference, both in the war effort and in proving that black aviators were the equals of anyone in the sky. What he couldn't yet know was how profound that difference would be, not just for the war, but for the future of American society. In the days following the encounter, the story of Jefferson's unconventional victory spread through the Allied air forces. Initially, it traveled through unofficial channels, pilots sharing stories over meals or drinks, ground crew passing along rumors they'd heard. By the time Jefferson returned to his unit in Italy, the incident had taken on near mythic proportions. "They're saying you took on 20 German fighters single-handed," Lieutenant Roberts greeted him with a grin. Jefferson shook his head. "More like 14, and I was trying to get away from most of them. That's not how Carter tells it. He came through here yesterday on his way to the hospital in Naples. Says you flew through the middle of the German formation like a madman." "That part might be accurate," Jefferson admitted. "The official impact came more slowly but with greater significance." General Williams made good on his promise to distribute Jefferson's tactical analysis. Within weeks, Fighter pilot training programs on both sides of the Atlantic were incorporating lessons from what was now being called the Jefferson Maneuver, though the official documents used more technical language about disruption of enemy formations through calculated aggression. More importantly, the engagement contributed to a gradual shift in how the 332nd was perceived within the military hierarchy. The unit had already been building a solid reputation as bomber escorts, but Jefferson's decisive victory against one of the Luftwaffe's elite formations, and specifically his defeat of a noted German ace, added a new dimension to that reputation. In August 1944, when General Davis requested that the 332nd be assigned to more varied combat missions beyond bomber escort, the request was approved without the usual resistance. By September, the Red Tails were conducting strafing runs against ground targets, flying reconnaissance missions, and even serving as fighter bombers when needed. For Jefferson personally, the aftermath of the engagement brought both recognition and responsibility. The Distinguished Flying Cross was formally presented in July, followed by a promotion to captain in August. By October, he was commanding his own flight of 4 aircraft, with new pilots looking to him for guidance and example. "The crazy thing is," he confided to Roberts one evening, as they sat outside their tents watching the sunset over the Italian countryside, "if I'd followed doctrine, if I'd obeyed orders and rejoined the formation, Carter would probably be dead or in a German prison camp, and we'd have lost more bombers." Roberts nodded. "Sometimes the book doesn't have all the answers, but we still have to learn the book inside and out before we can know when to ignore it," Jefferson replied. "That's what I keep telling the new kids. Learn the rules before you break them." As 1944 gave way to 1945 and Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies continued to diminish. Fuel shortages, loss of experienced pilots, and the overwhelming numbers of Allied aircraft made German air opposition increasingly rare. Jefferson's final aerial victory came in March 1945, when his flight encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighters near Munich. Despite the German aircraft's significant speed advantage, Jefferson managed to position his Mustang at the right moment to catch one of the jets as it slowed to land. It was his 7th confirmed kill of the war, making him an ace with 2 victories to spare. 2 weeks later, while strafing a German airfield, his Mustang was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The damage wasn't critical, a few holes in the wing and fuselage, but it marked the last time Jefferson would face enemy fire in the war. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, bringing the European conflict to an end. The 332nd Fighter Group returned to the United States in October 1945, receiving a welcome that was muted compared to that accorded to many white units. Despite their distinguished combat record, including Jefferson's now famous encounter with Müller's squadron, the pilots of the 332nd returned to a country where segregation and discrimination remained entrenched. Jefferson himself experienced this harsh reality when still in uniform with his Distinguished Flying Cross and captain's bars clearly visible. He was refused service at a restaurant in Virginia. It was a stark reminder that the battles he and his fellow black airmen had fought in Europe were only part of a longer struggle. Yet seeds of change had been planted. The demonstrated excellence of the Tuskegee Airmen had made an impression on many within the military establishment, including officers like General Williams, who held positions of influence. Their example would be cited repeatedly in the debates that eventually led to President Truman's 1948 executive order desegregating the armed forces. For Wilhelm Müller's family in Germany, the war's end brought only the official confirmation of what they had already suspected, that their son had been killed in action over France. The letter from the Luftwaffe High Command mentioned only that he had fallen in combat against American fighters, with no details about the specific circumstances or the identity of the pilot who had shot him down. It would be nearly 50 years before those details emerged, when aviation historians researching the air war over Normandy connected the German records of Müller's final mission with the American accounts of Jefferson's extraordinary engagement. By then, James Jefferson was in his 70s, long retired from a successful career in aerospace engineering, a field he had entered after using the GI Bill to complete his education. When contacted by the historians and informed about the identity of the German ace he had shot down, Jefferson's response was thoughtful. Muller was doing his duty as he saw it, just as I was doing mine, he told them. The tragedy is that capable young men like him were sacrificed for a terrible cause. I hope his family found peace. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, Jefferson was invited to a commemorative event in Washington, D.C., honoring the contributions of the Tuskegee Airmen. There, he was approached by an elderly German man who introduced himself as Heinrich Müller, Wilhelm Müller's younger brother. I wanted to meet the man who bested my brother, Heinrich explained, extending his hand. Wilhelm was considered unbeatable in our family. It seems he finally met his match. Jefferson shook the offered hand. Your brother was a formidable opponent. I was fortunate. No, Heinrich shook his head. From what I have read of the engagement, it was not fortune but skill and courage. Wilhelm would have respected that even from an enemy. The two men, once on opposite sides of history's largest conflict, spoke for over an hour. About the war, about their lives since, about the world that had emerged from the ashes of that terrible time. Before they parted, Heinrich handed Jefferson a small box. This belonged to Wilhelm. Our father gave it to him when he earned his pilot's wings. I think he would want you to have it. Inside was a silver pilot's pin, a small set of wings that had once adorned the uniform of a Luftwaffe ace. Jefferson was momentarily speechless. Finally, he said, I can't accept this. It should stay in your family. Heinrich smiled sadly. My sons have no interest in such things. The war is ancient history to them. Better it goes to someone who understands what it meant. Reluctantly, Jefferson accepted the gift. Thank you, I'll treasure it. That evening, at a gala dinner concluding the commemorative events, Jefferson was asked to say a few words about his famous encounter with Muller's squadron. Standing before an audience that included military officers, government officials, and fellow veterans, he thought carefully about what message he wanted to convey. People often ask me about that day, what I was thinking, how I found the courage to take on such odds, he began. The truth is simpler and more complicated than the legend suggests. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to protect my commander, my wingmen, my bombers. I was doing my duty. He paused, looking out at the faces watching him, white and black, young and old, military and civilian. What I understood that day, perhaps instinctively, was that sometimes conventional wisdom isn't enough. Sometimes you have to trust your training, your instincts, and your abilities to find a new approach when the standard one won't work. That lesson has served me well throughout my life. Jefferson reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver Luftwaffe wings that Heinrich Müller had given him earlier. He held them up so the audience could see. This belonged to the German pilot I shot down that day, Hauptmann Wilhelm Müller, a decorated ace with 67 victories. His brother gave it to me today, a gesture of reconciliation across what once seemed an unbridgeable divide. He looked at the small silver emblem, turning it so it caught the light. Müller and I never met in life, but we were connected by those few moments of combat. We were enemies, but we were also alike. Young men asked to fight for our countries, to put our lives at risk in pursuit of what we believed was right. The tragedy of war is that it sets such men against each other. Jefferson carefully returned the wings to his pocket. But the hope that emerges from that tragedy is that we can eventually recognize our common humanity, that we can move beyond the divisions of race and nation that once seemed so important and find what unites us rather than what separates us. He smiled at the assembled guests. That's the real legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen. Not just that we proved black pilots could fight as well as anyone, though we certainly did that, but that we helped demonstrate the fundamental truth that courage, skill, and character know no color. That lesson took too long to learn, and we're still learning it. But every step toward that understanding is a step toward a better world. As Jefferson returned to his seat amid applause, an Air Force cadet, a young black woman, approached him. "Sir," she said, "I'm in flight training now and we still study your maneuver. They tell us it shouldn't have worked, that it violated all the tactical principles. How did you know it would succeed?" Jefferson considered the question. "I didn't know," he admitted. "But I knew the conventional approach would fail. Sometimes, when the odds are stacked against you, the unexpected move is the only one with any chance of success." He glanced at her insignia, noting her status as a cadet officer. "Remember that when you command others someday. There's a time for following doctrine, and there's a time for trusting your judgment and the abilities of those who serve with you." The cadet nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As she walked away, Jefferson thought about how much had changed since that day over France in 1944. The military was now integrated. Women like that cadet were training as combat pilots, something unthinkable in his day. Progress had been made, though much remained to be done. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure, Robert Wesley, who had been Lieutenant Roberts all those years ago, his wingman during the fateful mission. "Still telling war stories, Jeff?" Wesley grinned, sitting down beside his old friend. "Just trying to make sure the lessons aren't forgotten," Jefferson replied. "How's retirement treating you?" "Can't complain. Grandkids keep me busy." Wesley's expression grew more serious. "You know, I think about that day sometimes. What you did was either the bravest or the craziest thing I ever saw in the war." "Probably a bit of both," Wesley nodded. "Probably, but it worked. And not just for the immediate situation. That story got around, Jeff. It changed minds." Jefferson knew what his friend meant. The account of a black pilot taking on elite German fighters against overwhelming odds and emerging victorious had been impossible to dismiss, even for those predisposed to doubt the capabilities of African-American aviators. "We all did our part," Jefferson said modestly. "Sure we did, but some parts were more spectacular than others." Wesley raised his glass in a toast. "To crazy maneuvers and the men brave enough to try them." Jefferson laughed and clinked his glass against his friend's. "To courage in all its forms." In the years that followed, Jefferson continued to speak about his experiences, particularly to young people. He emphasized not just the aerial combat, but the larger struggle for equality and recognition that he and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had faced. "We were fighting two wars," he would tell students during school visits. "One against the Axis powers overseas, and another against discrimination at home. Both were essential to fulfilling America's promise of freedom and equality for all." When asked if he harbored bitterness about the discrimination he had faced, despite his service and sacrifice, Jefferson would shake his head. "Bitterness is a luxury that accomplishes nothing," he would say. "I prefer to focus on the progress we've made and the work still to be done. Each generation has the opportunity to make things better than they found them. That's what matters." In 2007, Jefferson was present in the Capitol Rotunda when the Tuskegee Airmen collectively received the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian award. President George W. Bush, presenting the medal, specifically cited Jefferson's famous engagement as an example of the courage and skill that broke barriers and changed America for the better. It was a far cry from the return Jefferson had experienced in 1945, when his uniform and decorations hadn't been enough to get him served in a Virginia restaurant. The contrast was not lost on him or his fellow surviving airmen. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Jefferson for his thoughts on receiving such high recognition after so many years. "America takes time to fulfill its promises," he replied, "but it gets there eventually. That's why I've always believed in this country, even when it didn't seem to believe in me. The principles are sound, even when the execution is flawed." James Jefferson passed away peacefully in his sleep in 2012 at the age of 91. His funeral was attended by family, friends, fellow veterans, and senior Air Force officials. A formation of F-16 fighters performed the missing man formation overhead, a military honor rarely accorded to those who weren't career officers. Among his personal effects, carefully preserved in a small display case, was the silver Luftwaffe pin given to him by Heinrich Müller. Beside it lay his own distinguished flying cross and a photograph of the 382nd Fighter Group taken in Italy in 1944, young men in flight gear standing before their red-tailed Mustangs, unaware that they were making history. Jefferson's grandson, Michael, found another item as he helped settle his grandfather's affairs, a sealed envelope addressed to him, with instructions that it be opened after Jefferson's death. Inside was a letter and a small key. The letter directed Michael to a safe deposit box containing a manuscript, Jefferson's complete memoirs, including details about his famous encounter that he had never shared publicly. The manuscript began with a simple dedication: "To those who flew with me, those who flew against me, and those who will fly in skies I never knew. May you find clear horizons and safe landings." The memoirs were published the following year under the title Beyond Doctrine, a Tuskegee Airman's Story. The chapter detailing Jefferson's unconventional attack on Muller's squadron became required reading at the Air Force Academy, where instructors used it to illustrate the balance between tactical doctrine and combat initiative. In 2020, a Hollywood film based on Jefferson's encounter with Muller's squadron was released, bringing his story to an even wider audience. While taking some dramatic license with the details, as such productions inevitably do, it captured the essence of what made Jefferson's actions that day so remarkable: the willingness to attempt the unexpected when conventional approaches would likely fail. The film's release coincided with renewed national conversations about race, equality, and the ongoing struggle to ensure that America lives up to its professed ideals. In that context, Jefferson's story took on additional resonance, a reminder of the contributions that African Americans have made to the nation's security and prosperity, often while facing systemic obstacles to their own advancement. A particularly poignant scene in the film recreated Jefferson's meeting with Heinrich Müller, emphasizing the reconciliation between former enemies and the recognition of shared humanity across the divides of conflict. This aspect of the story struck a chord with audiences weary of division and hungry for examples of understanding across differences. In the final scene of the film, the actor playing the elderly Jefferson stands at the Air Force Academy, watching cadets of all races and genders training to fly. A young cadet asks him what lesson he would want them to take from his experience. The film Jefferson considers this, then says, "Trust your training, but don't be bound by it. Respect the wisdom of those who came before, but be willing to find your own path when necessary. And remember that the most important qualification for any pilot, any person really, isn't their background or appearance, but their character, judgment, and courage." As the credits rolled, audiences saw photographs of the real James Jefferson throughout his life, from his days as a young pilot to his final years as an elder statesman among the Tuskegee Airmen. The final image showed his gravestone at Arlington National Cemetery, where he rests among America's military heroes. The inscription reads, "Captain James Jefferson, United States Army Air Forces, Distinguished Flying Cross. He found a way when none seemed possible." 1920-2012. Today, the tactical innovation that Jefferson employed over France in 1944 is still studied by military aviators. The fundamental insight that attacking directly into a superior formation can disrupt enemy coordination and create opportunities despite numerical disadvantage has been incorporated into air combat doctrine around the world. But perhaps the more significant legacy lies in how Jefferson's story, and that of the Tuskegee Airmen collectively, helped change perceptions and open doors that had previously been closed. Their demonstrated excellence made it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that certain groups were inherently less capable or worthy of opportunity. That legacy continues in the diverse makeup of today's Air Force, where pilots of all backgrounds fly side by side, judged not by their color, but by their competence and character, just as Jefferson had hoped would someday be the case. In a very real sense, his unconventional maneuver on June 9, 1944, did more than save Captain Carter and disrupt Hauptmann Müller's fighter formation. It became part of a larger effort that helped change the course of American society, challenging assumptions and expanding possibilities for generations to come. The story of how one black pilot's crazy move outsmarted dozens of German fighters thus transcends its military significance, becoming instead a metaphor for the courage required to challenge established systems and expectations, and the positive change that such courage can ultimately bring about. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.